And, oh, here's Dave. All right. So this week we are looking at Parashat Lecha. I want to just read the first couple of lines because I think it's got I really like the
rhyme, the rhythm.
Yeah. Okay. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, Lech Lecha, me'artzecha, umi moladetecha, umi beit avicha el haaretz asher areka. Ve'escha legoy gadol ve'avarechecha, ve'agadla, shemecha, ve'hiye bracha. Ve'avarechecha, nevarechecha, umnikalelecha, aor univrechu, vecha kol mishpachot ha'adama. So the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those that curse you, and all of the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. Okay, so I like the sound of it in the Hebrew of those first of the promise that God makes. So the first section, of course, is then Abraham gets up and goes. He just does it. So he goes to Canaan from his homeland. He stops by way of Haran for a while, and then he lands in Canaan. But when he gets there, there's a famine, as happens. So he goes on to Egypt, as one does. But when he gets there, he's worried. Sarai, sorry, at this point there's still Abram and Sarai. Sarai is very beautiful, and so he tells the Egyptians that she's his sister, so that they won't kill him in order to take her, as a bride. So instead, they just kidnap her without killing Abram. I'm not sure that's a great upgrade, but I guess for Abram it is. And God sends a plague to Pharaoh's palace in order to keep Pharaoh from sleeping with Sarai. Whoop, I can't minimize when I'm recording. Okay, so anyway, so that works. Pharaoh figures out what's going on. He releases Sarai, and he sends Abram and Sarai back to Canaan with gifts. And he's like, all right, take some food and go, please get out. You've brought this plague. I don't want you here. So then they're back in Canaan, and there's a fight between Lot's shepherds and Abram's shepherds. That they had been trying to live peaceably together, and it's not working out. And so, for the good of the family, for the health of, this is a great lesson in Shalom Bayit, that sometimes you need space from the people you love most in order to keep loving them. So Lot moves away. He goes and settles himself in the city of Sodom. And God again reiterates to Abram his promise that he will have lots of land. Then a war breaks out in Canaan. All of the at this time, there's lots of like city states, and so there's these little minor kings fighting with each other over land. And in the process of that, Lot is amongst civilians captured. And so Aram goes to rescue him, and the king of Sodom is happy with this endeavor that Abram and his band of rescuers have basically returned that city-state back to the king that it belongs to. But Abram doesn't want any reward for it because he's feeling kind of nihilistic about the fact that he's getting really old and he still doesn't have children, and like, what's the deal with this promise from God? Nothing seems to be happening with it. Yes, Terry.
Couple questions. One is the king. We don't know how the king knew that it was Abram that sent the plague. So my question is, like, in reading Torah, do you just, like, it's not there, you move on? How do you deal with those kinds of things?
Well, we presume since Pharaoh released Sarai and told them to take their money and go,
Right.
that he did know it was Hashem that sent the plague.
Right, but we don't, I was just curious, like, well, how did he know? So that's why I'm asking, is it just he knew and you move on?
Yeah, he just knew. You move on. There's lots of situations in Tanakh where like the non-Jews know what the God of the Jews is up to, and
Okay.
it's like why do they believe it if they don't,
Yeah.
like, and then why don't they just convert to Judaism or to the Israelite religion, which wasn't quite Judaism at that time, but you know what I mean? Like,
I
if they
do.
if they recognize this ultimate power of Hashem, why are they still worshiping Egyptian gods? But like, we don't know. It's
And
just
so you
like
just accept it as is.
yeah, it's just part of life in the ancient Near East is that you could recognize the power of multiple gods and decide to still stick with your own local ones, even though this other one is punishing you. That like maybe you would want to appease that one
It's
that's
like a
sending a plague, but whatever.
non sequitur. It just is. So the other question I had was, Abram gave Lot his choice of land, but then after that, God told Abram that all the land was his, and Lot ended up in Sodom. So I was curious about, did what God say to Abram usurp what Abram said to Lot? And Lot was like annoyed and went to Sodom? Or is that another, like, it just is?
I mean, I think on the surface level, it's another, it just is, but we could certainly um, speculate wildly about Lot's intent or Lot's feelings. I do love to speculate wildly about,
Well, I'll give you my last question, and
yeah,
then we can decide where you want to speculate. I was intrigued by God's protectiveness of Hagar, and that God promised Hagar she would have lots of offspring.
yeah,
Correct?
right.
But then God said to Abram, or he might have been Abraham by now, that he will be essentially the father of nations. And I am curious about both of those.
Well, Ishmael is Abram's son, so
Right.
those are not mutually exclusive promises.
Okay.
Like,
Okay.
But it's a different promise. I mean, he did. I mean, Hagar did not do anything to. Anyway, he promises Ishmael or promises Hagar lots of descendants, but he doesn't do a covenant with them the way he does with Abraham. So it's a different kind of promise.
he doesn't covenant with Hagar, but he also doesn't really covenant with the matriarchs generally. He does, I mean, Ishmael is circumcised. He bears the mark of
Right.
the covenant in his own way as well. He ends up, God makes it clear that Isaac is the one that's going to continue on the particular promise
Right.
that God gives to Abram, but as Abram, Abram, Abraham, whichever one he is he's still Abram when Ishmael is born.
Okay.
He becomes Abraham after they're circumcised. But I distracted myself with that point. What was I saying? As Abraham's progeny, Ishmael is still entitled to his own covenant and piece of the promise. It's not the same promise, but it's still like he too will get to be a father of a nation.
So I guess I'm thinking about Islam and Judaism and finding it interesting that Hagar was the first woman that God spoke with, asked her to go back to be treated poorly with the promise of lots of offspring. I just, that intrigued me.
Well, okay, so I don't think she is promised that
Okay.
I guess she is. I will greatly, and they shall be too many to count. I always understood it as still being through Ishmael, but I guess she is. And you have a good point that he tells her to be sent back to be mistreated, but like also she's worried she will. No, never mind. I'm jumping ahead. It's the second time she gets sent away where she's worried she will die. Yeah, I, you know, I think part of the promise is, that she won't be mistreated so much if she goes back. There's a midrash there. Well, okay, so there's a couple that kind of orbit around this. They have to do with later, the like Parshiot 2 on from here, but sort of relates to your question that Abraham's third wife, Keturah, is actually Hagar. That's one midrash. And then there's another one that has to do with, so after the Akedah, Abram goes back to Hebron. It does not say Isaac goes with him. When Rebecca comes to meet him, like when Abram's servant is bringing Rebecca back to marry Isaac, he comes from this direction, from Ber Lahai Roi, this place where Hagar is where she is right now, but it's also where she and Ishmael settle after Sarah fully kicks them out in the next parsha. So there's a midrash that after the Akedah, Isaac goes and lives with Hagar and Ishmael.
Right.
And that they have their own family situation going, and that Isaac never comes back to Hebron until it's time to bury his father.
Right.
And so I don't know that it answers your question at all, but I think there's more like to family dynamics than like the Torah wants to tell us here about Hagar and Ishmael. That has to do, with her leaving and coming back, and what else is going on there. I think, again, we could speculate wildly about what's really happening.
I mean, her status is not the same as as Sarai. There's a difference.
Right. She's not a wife,
Definitely.
she's a concubine. Unless,
Dave-
yeah.
David had his hand up for a second until I interrupted.
Oh, sorry, Dave, what's up?
I'm changing the subject slightly.
Okay.
The part that I was surprised by, I knew of it, but I just didn't see. I didn't see why.
Okay.
When the angel of the Lord speaks to Hagar, he says that, you call him Ishmael, the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild ass of a man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the face of all his brethren. I don't even understand that last part. What does that mean? He shall dwell in the face of all his brethren. And why should he be a wild ass?
Well, why not?
He's a human being, and he's the son of Abraham.
Yes. I think so. Sometimes Torah it says similar things about Esau. And, it just does that sometimes to position the differences between the lesser son and the chosen son.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and how much, if you think about like the process of writing the Torah, from a historical point of view, if you were the firstborn that got cast aside and your little brother inherited everything, wouldn't you be kind of a wild ass? Wouldn't you be angry? And so then if that's what happens, and then somebody writes it down as prophecy after the fact, I think that's a little bit what happens with Ishmael and Esau. Although we don't get as much of Ishmael's emotions, his own story, the way we do get for Esau. Like when Esau cries to his father, "Have you no blessing for me?" It's so heartbreaking. And I kind of wish we saw something like that from Ishmael. Like, what does he think about? I guess he's maybe still young when they get cast out for good.
Or he understands, maybe not accepts, but understands his ranking with his mother as, like Debbie said, less than.
Sure, right. I guess as a son of a concubine, as opposed to Esau and Jacob were literally twins, there shouldn't have been the kind of distinction. And as to Dave's second point, Rashi says he shall dwell in the presence of his kinsmen, means his descendants will be so numerous that his territory will extend all over that which his brethren have. So if you think of Ishmaelites were nomads and they traveled all up and down Canaan and into Egypt, and that they didn't really have territory of their own. They were in the presence of their brethren.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you for
Yes,
explaining
Joel.
both of those.
And I'm in the Plout Torah, and
Yeah.
all it says about the wild ass is that it's like the wild ass of the desert, that he was mobile like the Bedouin. It leaves out the implication that an ass of a man might be less refined than I don't know what animal group would be less refined, but anyway, or more refined, but it leaves that part out. It just talks about the fact that they were the ancestor of Arabs and moved around a lot. But I don't know. That seems a little ignoring the other side of it. Yeah.
Well, and I think, again, this is another parallel with Esau. Like Rashi says, wild man, one who loves the open spaces to hunt wild animals. his hand shall be against everyone. He shall be a highwayman. So he's just like it all comes back to like he's rugged, he's a nomad, he's out hunting game, he's not a shepherd, he's not a sissy nebbish city Jew, whatever, like we're really positioning up the differences here. Yeah, Joel.
I can't help but notice the prophecy involved. Like, for example, if they're talking about the Hittites, the Girgashites, well, we don't even hear about them anymore. They're gone. But here are the Ishmaelites. And I just read in the paper this morning something about some crazy guy down in Nice, France, and he goes in, he beheads this one. Oh my God, that's a wild ass of an individual. That's the only way I can say it. Like no person of the Jewish faith, unless they were totally insane, would we read something like that. So is this prophetic? Because this, at the very latest, would have been written around 550 BCE. That's at least 1,000 years before Mohammed. I mean, it's such a long time ago. So how prophetic is Torah?
I mean, I would be wary of saying Torah is prophesying that Islam is violent by nature. There are extremists in every group. We might not see Jews beheading people, but we have Kahanists and Baruch Goldstein too, and I'm sure this guy in Nice is just as crazy as they were. So just say that. And the connection, I mean, Hagar is Egyptian, and it's like accepted traditionally by both Muslims and Jews that Ishmael is the ancestor of Muhammad. But like, that's not based on anything. That's based on Muhammad deciding that. He wasn't Egypt. Muhammad wasn't Egyptian. Like that's not where, there's no direct lineage there. It's more midrash. And so we can do with that whatever we want. So yeah. Yeah. What else? It didn't quite finish the summary, but I feel like we really got off on a good conversation there. So I don't know. Should
We
I
could go back to the summary.
Okay. So we were talking, let's see. So I got through like the first 2/3 of the parsha, and then we started talking about the specifics of Hagar and what's going on there. I think this section, excuse me, of let's see, before Ishmael's born, after God, after Abram turns down the gifts from the king of Sodom, and he again like kind of asks God, what's the deal with these promises? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so chapter 15, verse 9. God says, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, and a 3-year-old ram, as well as a turtle dove and a young bird. Okay, fine. Sacrifices are pretty normal, okay? So Abraham gets the animals, cuts them in half, and places each half of the animal like facing each other. that seems pretty specific, not really similar to other types of sacrifices. Not sure why he does that. At face value, the Torah doesn't really tell us. And birds of prey come down upon the carcass, and Abram drove them away. And as the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a dark dread descended upon him. And then God says, repeats the promise of the covenant. At face value, this doesn't answer Abram's question at all when he says, how will I know? Can you give me some sign now that I will have these progeny, that you promised me that we will have this land, whatever. So that really struck me. I never really took note of that part before. So then I look over at the commentaries, and Rashi brings some earlier midrash here to explain. So first of all, the three 3-year-old animals each are references to other nations that Rashi quotes Daniel and Psalms that that compare the enemy nations to various other types of animals, but Song of Songs says Israel is a dove. So there's a difference between here, and the birds are not cut in half the way the mammals are. And then where is the other part? I lost the other midrash. But then he says, this apparently was a pretty common commitment ritual in the ancient Near East, where two people who were binding some kind of covenant between them would walk between the two halves of the animals. So that's what's happening with God and Abraham, is that he's when he cuts the animals in half, and it's a sign of the covenant between God and Abram. And then the sun setting and the deep dread foretells the years in Egypt. And so it's all, I don't know. So it all kind of comes together if you read the commentaries, but it's still very metaphorical and very vague. And I don't know. I had a little bit of trouble fully wrapping my head around that one. And then the last section. So anyway, that's oh, sorry. Did somebody? No? Okay. I can't look at the text and look at your faces at the same time. Okay, so that happens, and then the thing with Sarai happens, which we kind of jumped ahead to, and then the hay, Abram and Sarai's names are changed to Abraham and Sarah, and the Parsha ends with the circumcision.
It's okay if I call you, you're out, don't call again. Okay, I'm in Torah Study, so I can't talk now.
Yeah, so that's what happens. At the age of 99, Abraham circumcised himself, his son, and his whole household. His son at this point being Ishmael, and then Isaac is born later, and so he's circumcised at the proper 8 days. That's where we get that tradition from. And in some traditional Muslim societies, boys are circumcised at 13 because that's how old Ishmael was. Which sounds terrible, but 13 just seems like the absolute worst age for that. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
Babies or grown men. I don't know about pubescent children.
Is that what the tradition is with Muslims? When the boys
Yeah, I don't know how much that's still practiced, but for, you know.
Wow.
Wow.
So I'm sorry, I was interrupted, but we're talking about the covenant now?
Yeah, I just kind of wrapped up the rest of the Torah, which ends with the end of the Parsha, which ends with the circumcision.
I was struck that the covenant, which is like the basis for the whole rest of the Torah, kind of, the only thing, and I'm sorry, guys, I don't mean to minimize it, but the only thing that's asked of the Jews is, of the Hebrews, of God's people, is to do the circumcision. It doesn't say any place about that they must keep God's laws, or he's the only God, the beginning of the Ten Commandments, at least, that all, so unless it's implied that the circumcision stands for all that. I was surprised that that's all there was in there.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fair point, because it only applies to half the camp, right? So, how does that really fully signify the depth of the covenant?
And I
mean,
guess it's I'm sorry, because of the order of this Torah study that we started back toward the end of the book, and now we're doing the beginning of the book, and all, page after page after page about obeying God and keeping his commandments, and especially making sure that you do not pray to any other gods. Even that's not in here. And I just sort of assumed that was the covenant, that when Abram became Abraham, he was recognizing God as his only God, and even that's not in here, and that surprised me.
Right. Well, so there's two ways to look at that, I think. I mean, there's more than two ways, but there's two things that come to my mind. One is that, just from like a historical evolutionary point of view, this is way longer ago. Like the time period between Abraham and Moses, as well as probably the difference in authors of like who wrote Genesis and who wrote Exodus. There is like a very different view of God and relationship with the divine in these different parts. Like in Genesis, we're still really in, as Joel says, henotheism. Like even Abraham, who recognizes the supremacy of God, he's still in this world where there are many gods. Like the concept of Hashem as the one really comes later. I'm not sure that it's still fully taken hold by the end of the Torah, but it's definitely more in place. And then the other piece of that, the like more philosophical, it's the other side of the same coin, but from a more purely religious, less historical point of view, is that there is a second covenant with the people of Israel at Sinai, that this is a preliminary promise.
Okay, that works.
The full context of the covenant with the whole people of Israel doesn't come until Sinai.
The
Okay,
full doctrine. Go ahead, Debbie.
Yeah. No, I guess maybe the act of circumcision is the recognition of the supremacy of God. I know about the other gods still exist, but this to me didn't even talk about the supremacy of our God, but maybe that's what the circumcision recognizes, that you're doing this for me. And then, and the rest of it comes at Sinai. That makes sense to me, yes.
So I've used the analogy many times before that like the the Torah, or especially the Ten Commandments or whatever, is like the ketubah, right? Sinai is a marriage between God and the people of Israel, and a marriage is a covenant, and our relationship with God is a covenant, and the you know the commandments are the ketubah. So this is like the circumcision is the engagement ring. This is the promise of we will be engaging in a deeper covenant to come, but we're already committed. And if I go lust after other gods, I have violated this preliminary covenant kind of thing.
That makes sense.
What else? What did Joel just put in the chat? As late as Kings chapter 2. Yeah. The continuing idol worship happens throughout all of the Tanakh. The exact evolution of like when idol worship becomes recognized fully and exclusively and complete, any kind of worship of anything that isn't Hashem is idol worship, like is completely false, as opposed to a different God that there's a difference between saying Jews should not worship the Asherah because it's not our God, and that's a violation of our covenant, versus saying the Asherah is an inanimate object and anyone who worships it is a dummy. Like those are different things.
Right.
And there definitely continues to be issues with idol worship throughout the whole Tanakh, but there's kind of a spectrum between those two viewpoints of the idol worship that we see evolve through the Tanakh, and I'm not sure I think it continues to evolve post-biblically a bit as well.
Okay.
Up until I don't know, up until the Hasmoneans. I mean, I don't know what the final point, what the final nail in that coffin is, but it continues for a while, that evolution away from acknowledging any worth to other gods. Yes, Joel.
Yeah, and of course, it's still with us today, but I think we shouldn't talk about that because we want to all get along. Let's say it that way. But I think it's still with us today. But I did want to point out in chapter 15 something of interest in the Hebrew that I just noticed this time around, which is, so here's what's happening. Abraham says, "Oh God, will thou give me, seeing I go childless? And he that shall be possessor of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." And in the Hebrew, I noticed that the possessor of my house says Uven Meshech Beti. Meshech, the word, and that means the possessor. In other words, I'm going to die childless, and I'm going to turn this over to my right-hand man, who is Eliezer. So here's Meshech. And a little while later, it's describing him. It says, who? Damesek Eliezer. Damesek. It's the same roots, except different nekudot. So it's mem, shin, kuf. It's the same. In it's pronounced differently, but it's the same word. So it's kind of a word play, kind of a pun that shows me the humanity that someone actually wrote this right into that verse and said, isn't this an interesting little play on words? I'm going to be using the same description. Meshech, Mesek. That's at verse 2.
Yeah. Fun word play.
My phone.
But then, of course, he is denied that possession. Eliezer's a good guy.
Have we seen anything else about him besides this?
He's the one that goes and gets Rebecca for
Ah,
Isaac.
okay,
And
okay.
there's a scene at some point, I think it's in that section right before he leaves to go get Rebecca, where um he and Abraham take oaths with each other. He's just very loyal. And that, like, especially considering he almost was the heir, like he could have been rich. And instead he stays a servant, but he does it loyally, and he helps the heir, the rightful heir, inherit what could have been his. And like, I don't know, maybe I've just
Sounds
been watching
right.
too much Game of Thrones, but I feel like that's commendable. He doesn't try to suffocate Isaac.
Or worse. Oh, dear.
Name changes are a big deal. I don't know if that jumps out at anybody, but we get it here. We get it with Jacob and becoming Israel. It always signifies a change in the relationship with God. Even Esther, Hadassah means myrtle, which is, a proper old lady name, just like Hadassah. And but Esther means I will hide. So just like Esther hides herself from God, or I will secret myself away. Seter is a secret. And just like, she hides who she is, she hides from God. She hides her Jewishness, like there's meaning in names, deep meaning in names in the Tanakh.
We haven't gotten to the chapter yet where the angels come and tell Sarah that she's going to be a mom. But I noticed that God tells Abraham what her son's name is going to be, and he told Hagar what her son's name was going to be. So it's a kind of foreshadowing of the story, but I guess the name coming from God makes the name mean that much more, I guess.
Yeah. Well, okay, yeah. God, did he already throw himself on his face and laugh when God tells him his name will be
Yeah,
Isaac?
Abraham, right.
Yeah, okay.
And the story we always tell is that Sarah laughed, and that's
Right.
how, but Abraham did laugh before she laughed, yes.
What kind of laugh was it?
A guffaw.
Could be a happy laugh or a guffaw or.
I think Sarah's laugh is often understood as bitter.
Okay.
Like it's a incredulous.
That's different. Like, why now?
Yeah. Yeah, Joel.
Here's a question for people. What's the connection between the fact that Sarah laughed and the name that they gave their son? Why did they call him Isaac? And it has to do with the laughter.
But in this portion, it's Abraham that laughs too, so.
Which I'm glad that we took note of that. Because so Yitzchak means he laughed. And often it's pointed out like it's sort of sad because Isaac doesn't laugh. Isaac is a terribly traumatized boy. And like he didn't laugh, his mother laughed, but maybe the he in question is his father.
And Abraham is also incredulous because it says Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed as he said to himself. It doesn't say he said it to God, it says he said it to himself. At least this translation puts it that way. Can a child be born to a man 100 years old, or can Sarah bear a child as 90? And then
I
God
can see them being a
tells him
little
to-
bitter.
Yeah,
I could have saved a lot of pain for a lot of people if God had done this earlier.
Yeah. And that's a running motif in the Torah, right? Rachel, Hannah. Rebecca doesn't seem to have trouble getting pregnant, but she has a terrible pregnancy. Who else? I feel like I'm missing many.
goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Is that why we have morning sickness?
Yeah. And childbearing pains.
Now that's to keep the baby in. The morning sickness I never understood.
But at least we don't have circumcision. At least most of us don't.
True. Most of us. In some
Most.
cultures.
You're right.
Right, that's what I'm saying. There are some
Yeah.
cultures that. But God had nothing to do with that. So he had to do with the circumcision and the childbirthing pain. So maybe that's part of it. Maybe he's trying to balance it out a little bit.
I think it proves God is a woman. The
Yeah, I think you're
circumcision.
right. Yep,
Circum-
the ultimate.
All right. Well, I got
There's
nothing
not
to say
much
about-
else. Lead us someplace else, Rabbi.
All right. Well, I don't know. I mean, that is the end of the Parsha.
Well,
So,
So
yeah.
I guess the other question that came to me when I was reading this, and there's no, we have discussions a little bit of Moses' character and David's character, but there's no discussion of Abraham or Abram at all, and why God picked him out of all the myriads of people that lived at that time or any other time, why God picked Abram to start this whole thing off.
Yeah.
I
There's
mean, even
nothing.
Noah said Noah was a very righteous man, but Abram, there's not a single adjective about, at least not in my translation, about what he was like.
No, we get the genealogy so that we know he is descended from Noah's preferred son. I guess if the rest of the world was killed, everybody descends from Noah. But we get the genealogy, and then yeah, I mean the fact that he goes, the fact that he listens, that he has faith is considered, the proof itself, and then the midrash goes from there. So there are some midrashim there's of course the most famous one that some people even like get confused when they read this parsha and they're like, where's the story of the smashing the idols? Like, it's not in here, it's a midrash. But there's that story, of course, that Abraham's father was an idol maker, and he smashed all of the statuettes, and his father came back and yelled at him, and he was like, well, maybe the idols smashed themselves. And he kind of catches his father, and it's like, you either have to admit that your gods aren't real, or like, or I'm off the hook. So so there's that, his predisposition to monotheism. And then there are some others, like I've only seen in like children's story versions, so I'm not sure where they originate in the rabbinic midrash, but of God going and offering this covenant or asking other people to go, and they don't, or they start out on their journey and get distracted, being merchants or successful shepherds or whatever. And the fact that Abraham goes all the way down and continues, calling upon God, like, where's my heir? You made me these promises, talking to God. That's the driving force of the relationship. And then of course, like in next week's parsha, when Abraham is willing to challenge God against the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, like that's a huge turning point as well in how we understand Abraham as the first Jew. Yeah, Joel, I'm just seeing what you put in the chat as well.
Yeah, can I say a word about the Bachar, the chosen, the younger offspring seems to be chosen throughout Torah. And I was thinking a while ago, as I'm thinking about anthropology, that the Neanderthals, of course, were also humans. Okay, they had larger brains than we have. They're very strong. They have so many things going for them, yet they were not the chosen people. Okay, that fell to Homo sapiens. And I started to think about in biology what we call founder populations. For example, just a few people start heading east, and before you know it, they become Oriental type populations, and they develop epicanthic folds. These epicanthic, what we refer to as Asian, whatever.
Right.
So we always need a founder population. And also, I think in social sciences and in religion, the same is true. Now, we don't need 100 million, we don't need 500 million people, but we need a small core group that's going to hang together and get the same ideas, this is what we've been chosen to do. So I'm just trying to analogize this to see what our position is in the world. And it's a very comforting idea.
Amen. Last thoughts? We got 4 minutes left.
I just, again, as I was reading the 12, chapter 10, verse 10, I mean, which is the start of his trip down to Egypt. It's so, such a prequel to the whole Exodus story. It's you almost wonder why it's in there, except for the fact that Abram sort of asked Sarah for that little favor, but that was a good excuse for a plague too.
Yeah. Well, so there's, it was common in the ancient, Egypt was like the biggest, closest, or it was the closest big kingdom. Is that how I want to say it? Anyway, so if there was a famine in Canaan, you went to Egypt because they almost certainly had some stores of food. The the story of Joseph and his dreams and the 7 years worth is like, okay, maybe that's special. But in any kind of time of difficulty, there was likely to be more social services in Egypt because they had a bigger, more intricate
Society.
society, power structures, as opposed to the little warring city states of Canaan. So that's that. And which is also like that comes into play in the more common now, like historical, anthropological views on the Exodus story of like, people were coming and going between Egypt and Canaan all the time. And like,
Mhm.
that's why maybe there's no significant evidence of the Exodus as we read about it in the Torah, because like it wasn't that big a deal at the time actually, and it just became part of this larger mythos of our people. And the situation with Sarah, we see almost the same thing repeats with Isaac and Rebecca. They don't go to Egypt, but they go south and encounter some other local king, and the same thing happens with Rebecca. So the Torah does, or the Tanakh loves to create these tropes, and gives us a little insight, I think, into how our ancestors lived and how they understood the world.
Mhm. Yeah, just like movies, there's all the outtakes before you get the actual movie.
Yeah.
I wish we had the outtakes.
Yeah. Who knows?
Right.
I mean, I think to some extent that's what like some of the like the Qumran scrolls and the Samaritan Bible and some of that
Mhm.
stuff that we have that's like,
Right.
similar but different. We get like the tiniest insight into what got changed over time, but there's no way to have the original manuscripts.
I think David Raymer, that should be his next book.
Andrew Raymer, yeah,
Andrew, I'm sorry.
I would read that.
His brother was David.
Sure.
Joe,
Yeah.
question for Joe. What is the information you're sending us on chat?
Yes, the Merneptah Stele is the only archaeological record of what they say is Israel is vanquished, of course, in the Egyptian language. That's the only reference to it.
Yeah.
There's something else of interest that we learned much later. The land of Egypt is loaded with schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis is the river flu. Now today,
Wait, hold on. Can the interference? Okay, can you repeat that? The land of Egypt is filled with what?
schistosomiasis, which is also known as a river fluke. That's what type of organism it is. And of course, it was not known back in the day, but it is known today. And my reference, of course, is the UPenn Museum, which specializes in archaeology of Egypt and the region. So, of course, the schistosomiasis, because Egypt is such a flat plain, and it was so rich because the Nile overflows
Mhm.
the plateau and makes it a wonderful place for growing crops. But it's also the perfect environment for schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis affects about 200 to 300 million people in the world today, in different places, India, here and there. So it's very interesting that no, Egypt isn't the place to be. Let's bring yourselves up out of Egypt and bring yourselves up to this wonderful land, which has a lot of elevation. There's mountains and the rivers flow down. No schistosomiasis. So once again, it's a case of, let's say, Bible intersecting with modern scholarship.
Yeah.
And for David, one more thing. Of course, a lot of what we read in Torah is mashal, meaning it's a metaphorization, metaphor.
Mhm.
Meaning we're not reading history, we're reading values, we're just, it's a different thing. So we have to kind of look at the deeper meaning whenever we see midrash, whenever we see stories in Torah that challenge us intellectually. We want to combine both because that's how our brains operate. One half of my brain works on logic. The other half is based on emotion. We want to join both together. Both are so necessary, especially in religion.
True. Thank you, Joel.
Welcome.
All right. Well, that feels like a good place to end. Lots to think about. So next week we'll continue with Va'era. Wait, let me look at it. There's Va'era and Vayera. Which one is this? I get the names mixed up. Go. Oh, Vayera. Yes, this one has the yud. It's the one with one later that doesn't. Okay, anyway, we'll continue next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.